These walls weren't built to keep people out, they were built to keep something dangerous, unstable, or unstoppable in. Today I'm counting down 15 walls designed to keep something in. Number 15. The Gardens by the Bay Biodome Walls. So Singapore is known for its skyline, but just south of Marina Bay, a very different type of wall rises into view, curved, gleaming, and completely transparent. These aren't office buildings or malls, they are biodome walls, the high-arching glass structures that make up the Gardens by the Bay's cloud forest and flower dome. And unlike most walls that keep nature out, these walls were built to keep it in. The dome stands at 58 meters tall, and it stretches across 1.2 hectares and contains a living mountain covered in orchids, ferns, and plants usually found in the misty cloud forests of Central and South America or Southeast Asia. Its outer shell is a wall of 4,500 double-glazed glass panels, supported by steel ribs and a cooled concrete foundation. Every panel wasn't designed for an aesthetic, but for containment. Inside, the chilled air circulates through hidden ducts beneath the walkways and waterfalls, and misting nozzles emit a cloud every 2 hours. If the wall failed, let's say a crack in the glazing or a miscalibration, humidity would drop and dozens of species would begin to perish. This wall isn't protecting people from the elements, it's protecting the elements from people. These aren't just greenhouses, they are sealed biomes. They're self-contained simulations of ecological zones thousands of miles from their origin. In a world facing environmental changes, Singapore's biodome walls represent a quieter kind of defense, not against enemies but against entropy. They are keeping the fragile, beautiful environments from slipping away. Number 14. The flood walls of New Orleans pumping stations, containing a city's own water. So New Orleans, it's famous for its music, its food, and of course its resilience. But beneath the surface of jazz and celebration lies a city constantly at war with its own geography. Much of New Orleans sits below sea level, wedged in between the Mississippi River, Lake Pontchartrain, and the Gulf of Mexico. Rainfall doesn't drain naturally, it accumulates here, and when storms roll in, the city doesn't just flood from without, it floods from within. That's why one of the most critical features of the city's infrastructure is a series of flood walls, not just levees or berms, but thick concrete reinforced walls built around the city's pumping stations. These are designed to keep New Orleans' own floodwaters inside the drainage system until they can be pumped out. Take pumping station number 6, one of the oldest and largest in the system. It sits alongside the 17th Street Canal, a location that became famous during Hurricane Katrina. Surrounding the station is a flood wall system that looks like a fortress. 15-foot-high concrete walls with steel pilings driven deep down, forming a box around the facility and its connected canal intake. This wall holds back the enormous volume of urban runoff that the pumps process, millions of gallons per hour during a storm. If these flood walls didn't exist, the water being gathered would simply overflow into adjacent neighborhoods. The walls ensure that as the streets drain, that runoff stays trapped inside the system. Unlike levees designed to guard perimeters, these pumping station walls are inward-facing. Each one is fitted with access ports for emergency maintenance, and some are even equipped with automated gates that can isolate segments if flow becomes unstable. In most cities, storm water drains by gravity, but in New Orleans, walls remind us that when your lowest point is inside your city, you gotta build your defenses to hold your own waters at bay. Number 13. The Biocurity Wall of Plum Island. Just off the northeastern tip of Long Island in New York lies an island most Americans have never visited, but almost everyone would be wise to know about: Plum Island. A windswept 840-acre plot of land owned by the U.S. government. It houses one of the most secure and secretive biological research facilities in the Western Hemisphere, the Plum Island Animal Disease Center. And though it might not be enclosed by the soaring stone battlements of medieval castles, it is surrounded by one of the most critical containment systems in modern history, a wall built not to keep enemies out but to keep something far more dangerous in. Founded in 1954 during the Cold War, the Plum Island Animal Disease Center was established by the United States Department of Agriculture as a frontline defense against foreign animal diseases. Its founding mission was straightforward, but it was vital: to research, diagnose, and develop countermeasures for highly contagious animal pathogens, most notably foot and mouth disease, one of the most infectious livestock illnesses on the planet. FMD is so virulent that a single microscopic droplet can infect entire herds, shutting down agriculture systems and food chains. It can spread through the air, on clothing, in the dirt, on a boot. The economics and societal consequences of a U.S. outbreak could easily surpass billions of dollars within weeks. For that reason, strict U.S. law prohibits research on live FMD virus anywhere on the mainland. Plum Island, surrounded by water, was chosen because if an escape were to happen, the ocean itself would serve as an additional natural barrier. The entire island is kind of like its own penitentiary, but the inmates are microscopic, and their release would constitute a biological disaster. Over the years, Plum Island has been the subject of intense theories, rumors of secret germ warfare programs, Lyme disease origins, or mutant creatures washing up on the nearby shores. And while these theories remain unfounded in documented fact, they point to cultural anxiety rooted in something very real, the fear of what might happen if the wall fails. In 2001, after the 9/11 attacks, concerns were raised that Plum Island might be a target for bioterrorism. The Department of Homeland Security took over operations, upgrading security even further, and ironically, this made the island both safer and more secretive. It's one of the few places in the U.S. where almost no one is allowed to casually visit, photograph, or even approach. In a way, Plum Island's story is about trust. Trust in systems, trust in science, and trust in walls you can't see but which protect you all the same. The danger it contains is not just academic. If a pathogen like FMD were to breach containment, it would cripple the U.S. livestock economy. It could lead to panic, food shortages, and a mass slaughter of animals on a scale never before seen. The wall around Plum Island may not cast a shadow, but it holds within it some of the most potent forces biology has ever conjured up. And it serves as one of the most important containment structures in the world. Number 12. The Biofence of Purbeck. In the hills of Surrey in England, tucked between grazing pastures and tidy hedgerows, is a facility that few outside the world of virology have ever heard of, but one whose existence is critical to the safety of British agriculture. This is the Purbeck Institute, a world-class research center for animal diseases. Like Plum Island in the United States, Purbeck specializes in the study of highly contagious animal diseases, especially foot and mouth disease. The 2001 outbreak of foot and mouth in the UK led to the slaughter of over 6 million animals, and it cost the nation billions of dollars. It was a biological crisis of national proportions, and its scars remain fresh in the memory of veterinarians, farmers, and politicians. This facility operates biosafety level 4 and 3 labs, among the most secure in the world, and within these rooms diseases like African swine fever, blue tongue virus, and various strains of FMD are studied, sequenced, and in some cases, challenged against potential vaccines. But for the outside world to remain untouched, every action inside there has to happen under layered protocols that effectively wall off every molecule of danger. The perimeter fence is only the outermost line of defense. Within that lies a cascading series of barriers, sealed labs with negative air pressure, so that means air flows into the room but never out, HEPA-filtered exhaust systems, ultraviolet decontamination, sealed waste systems, autoclaves, and airlock entry procedures. The staff has to wear full-body containment suits and have to undergo decontamination both entering and exiting workspaces. Even wastewater is treated chemically and heat sterilized before being released. The containment system is so sensitive that even a microscopic crack in protocol can lead to disaster. In fact, Purbeck was at the center of a major controversy in 2007 when a strain of FMD virus escaped, not due to a laboratory breach, but because of a leaky pipe between the lab and a nearby commercial vaccine producer. The virus contaminated the soil, leading to a local outbreak, and that incident, though quickly contained, triggered a sweeping overhaul of their security infrastructure. One might wonder, why not simply stop studying these diseases? But the reality is pretty grim. FMD and similar illnesses are constantly changing and evolving. They threaten livestock, industries in Asia, Africa, and South America. And without facilities like this, the world would be blind to these mutations, the outbreaks, and the shifting risk. In other words, the wall has to hold, not just for Britain, but the entire global food supply. Number 11. The wall around Goolot. In the Adriatic Sea lies an island that at first glance looks like any other Croatian outcrop. It's rocky, sun-drenched, and windswept. But Goolot, literally translated to barren island, carries with it a legacy of dread. Throughout the mid-20th century, this desolate island served as a prison camp under the former Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and it was specifically designed to contain not criminals, but political deviants. More than that, it was encircled and defined by a wall that wasn't simply physical, but psychological, ideological, and brutally effective at keeping something in: unwanted belief. Goolot was never officially marked on tourist maps, and there were no public records detailing its operations during its height in the 1950s and 60s. The prison's primary purpose was to re-educate political prisoners, most of them communists who had shown sympathy for Stalin after the Tito-Stalin split of 1948. In that tense political chess match of the early Cold War, Josip Broz Tito's Yugoslavia became one of the few Eastern Bloc nations to reject direct Soviet control. Anyone within Yugoslavia who disagreed, whether openly or in private, was branded a traitor and sent to the island. There was no trial, there was no appeal, there was no clear sentence. Once you got sent there, the person was effectively erased. Inmates here were often left shirtless under the sun or freezing in tattered clothing. But what truly turned it into a fortress wasn't just the geography, it was the prison complex itself, surrounded by a high perimeter wall of stone and concrete that followed the ridges of the island's terrain. The wall had no architecture, it really didn't need it. Its purpose was containment and psychological intimidation. But beyond the physical wall was an even more suffocating barrier: the rule of enforced betrayal. Inmates were required to inform on one another. Confessions, true or not, were extracted through relentless interrogations. In many cases, political prisoners were forced to beat fellow prisoners who refused to reform. The wall thus extended inward, forming invisible partitions between people who might otherwise have resisted together. Escape was virtually impossible. The island was too far from the mainland to swim, and the coastline ensured that boats couldn't approach undetected. The wall did its job. No one left without being broken or buried. After the fall of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, Goolot was abandoned. Nature began reclaiming those cracked walls and rusting gates, and today the site is occasionally visited by tourists or historians, but no official memorial exists. The wall still stands, weathered and forgotten, but its true barrier lives on in the unspoken memories of those who once lived inside it. Number 10. The Fence of Woomera. In the center of Australia's Red Desert lies a place that seems to defy the very idea of openness. The Woomera Prohibited Area, the WPA. This is an expanse of over 122,000 square kilometers, larger than many countries. It's a territory that's remained sealed, in part and in full, for more than 70 years. Though there is no single concrete wall encircling it, Woomera's barrier is real, enforced, and unyielding. In fact, it might be the largest containment zone on the planet ever designated by a democratic nation. It's not meant to keep people out. It was built to keep technology, wreckage, radioactive materials, and secrets firmly inside. Established in 1947 as a part of a joint military agreement between the United Kingdom and Australia, the goal was to create a weapons testing range far from populated areas, a place where rockets, missiles, and even nuclear-capable delivery systems could be developed and fired without international scrutiny. Unlike prisons or nuclear plants, Woomera's wall wasn't built from stone or metal. It's layered restrictions, overlapping jurisdictions, and intense surveillance. Within this boundary, dozens of smaller test zones exist, each surrounded by their own fences and exclusion perimeters. One of the most tightly guarded is the site of the Blue Streak missile tests. Its British rocket system, abandoned decades ago, but still surrounded by reinforced fencing. Others are closely guarded because of experimental aircraft testing, unmanned drones, or because they serve as dumping grounds for obsolete or failed missile components. Some of that material, especially components used in early rocket fuel mixtures and guidance computers, remain sealed within metal containers or buried in the sand, too hazardous or too secret to retrieve. For decades, the people of Australia knew little about what happened at Woomera. The government enforced strict censorship, and even today portions of the site are protected by laws. Journalists have been arrested for even attempting to photograph inside, and environmental activists have repeatedly been turned away. Woomera's boundary wasn't just built to secure a site, it was built to secure a moment in history when nations sought dominance through rockets, secrecy, and the illusion of control. Woomera is once again active, but its walls remain closed to the outside, not just to contain current projects, but to quarantine the ghosts of the past. Number 9. The Exclusion Zone Wall of Chernobyl. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. It was an industrial accident made worse by arrogance, poor design, and human error. In the seconds that followed the explosion, a plume of radioactive material burst into the night sky and began to spread across Europe. But as the fallout traveled outward, the Soviet authorities scrambled to construct something inward, a containment zone, a border, a wall. That wall eventually became the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, one of the most unique and haunting boundaries on the planet. With a radius of roughly 19 miles around the reactor site, this zone forms the de facto perimeter that separates the containment landscape from the rest of the world. Immediately after the explosion, Soviet forces moved quickly to evacuate the nearby town of Pripyat, a once thriving model city built for nuclear workers and their families. But the wall wasn't static. It expanded and contracted over time as radioactive contamination was better mapped and understood. Cesium-137, strontium-90, and plutonium particles settled unevenly across the region, making some zones within the 30-kilometer radius relatively safe. Yet the wall has failed in subtle ways. Within a few years, plants began to return, then animals, then humans. Not officially but illegally, known as self-settlers, a small number of elderly residents returned to the abandoned villages in the 1990s, living without electricity or running water. The Chernobyl wall, then, is multi-layered. There's the outer wall of the exclusion zone, the inner wall of checkpoints and fences, and the psychological wall of fear and taboo. And the deepest wall of all, the massive sarcophagus built not to bury the dead, but to trap the invisible force that killed them. The zone may appear to be open land from above, but its true boundary lies in the invisible energy that lingers. It's a wall that can't be climbed, nor seen, nor easily dismantled. Number 8. The Great Wall of the Hanford Site. Along the Columbia River in southeastern Washington state, there exists a patch of land the size of half the state of Rhode Island that holds the deadliest waste ever produced on American soil. This is the Hanford Site, an unassuming landscape of sagebrush and sand that once fueled the nuclear age and now must contain the aftermath. Established in 1943 as part of the Manhattan Project, Hanford was where the U.S. secretly built the first full-scale plutonium production center. The plutonium used in the Nagasaki bomb came from Hanford, but once the war ended, the site didn't shut down. Instead, it expanded into a complex of 9 nuclear reactors and 5 massive processing facilities. For decades, the byproducts were dumped into underground tanks, poured into unlined trenches, or released directly into the environment. As public awareness grew, so too did the need to build something to contain it all, a wall. But this just wasn't a concrete and steel wall, it was a policy, perimeter fencing, underground tank farms, no-fly zones. It was, and still is, America's largest attempt to lock down the nuclear genie it once released. The central feature of the containment system are the 177 underground storage tanks that hold over 50 million gallons of radioactive sludge. These tanks are buried beneath reinforced soil berms protected by radiation sensors, seismic monitoring, and a physical perimeter fence. These tanks are aging. Many were built in the 1940s and 50s, and over 60 have leaked. Some are at risk of total collapse. The wall built to contain them is constantly being reinforced. New steel double-shelled tanks, vitrification efforts that turn waste into solid glass, and a massive cleanup campaign. But despite decades of effort and over $100 billion in spending, the site remains one of the most contaminated places on the planet. Access to the core tank farms is restricted to trained personnel who have to undergo special radiation training. The roads leading in are blocked by multiple checkpoints, each manned by security contractors who operate under federal orders. Drone surveillance monitors the airspace, which itself is restricted under the FAA rules. Warning signs are posted every few hundred feet. Danger, radiological hazard, restricted area, and do not enter. In the 1980s, concerns grew that Hanford's buried waste might someday reach the water table. A network of monitoring wells was drilled around the site, and every year new fence lines are installed. Old tank domes are reinforced, and temporary structures are upgraded to keep the public out and the danger in. And this wall must hold, because if it doesn't, the next great nuclear disaster might not come from an explosion. It might come from a slow, silent seep through the very ground that was supposed to keep it locked away. Moving on to number 7, the Wall of San Quentin State Prison. Just north of San Francisco, where the Pacific Ocean breathes its salt and fog into the bay, is one of America's oldest and most infamous penitentiaries, San Quentin State Prison. Its most defining feature is the wall, thick, cold, and relentless, and unlike security fencing or temporary barriers, San Quentin's wall is permanent. It's never meant to keep threats out, it was built to lock the most dangerous men in indefinitely. San Quentin opened its gates in 1852 during the Gold Rush era, when California was still untamed and law enforcement was little more than a reactionary force. Over the years, as violent crime surged and the American justice system hardened, San Quentin evolved into a high-security prison for the worst offenders in the state, including California's death row inmates. But unlike other prisons, where multiple layers of fences serve as the main obstacle, San Quentin relies on its singular, monolithic wall as its ultimate expression of authority. The wall isn't just a physical boundary, it represents a social and moral one. Inmates here are not simply being punished, they're being separated, condemned to exist in a space where time moves differently, where the wall compresses the outside world into a memory or a distant concept. In the 1970s and 80s, the prison was known for its radical political undercurrents, especially during the incarceration of figures like George Jackson, co-founder of the Marxist-Leninist Black Guerrilla family. Books, letters, and manifestos circulated clandestinely, and the wall was a barrier not only to escape but to ideas escaping. When Jackson was killed in 1971 during a botched escape attempt, the prison doubled down on its restrictions. More patrols, more fencing, more concrete. Even executions, when they happened, took place in an enclosed, windowless chamber sealed behind layers of reinforced doors. In more recent years, it's undergone an image shift. Rehabilitation programs, educational outreach, and even podcasts like Ear Hustle, produced by inmates inside the wall, have shown a more human face to the prison. But even these initiatives take place with the unyielding limits of the perimeter. The wall still decides who speaks and who hears. It stood for over 170 years. It's witnessed the rise and fall of governors, the abolishment and reinstatement of the death penalty, and the slow evolution of prison policy. Through all of that, the wall remained, quietly doing its job, not to protect from outside threats, but to guarantee that certain people, certain sentences, and certain histories never leave. Number 6. The Containment Wall of the Asse Mine in Germany. In Lower Saxony, in Germany, lies a former salt mine with a secret. It's known as Asse II. The mine once served industrial purposes, then it briefly hosted scientific experiments before being converted into something far more consequential, a storage facility for radioactive waste. But unlike a carefully designed vault of modern nuclear repositories, Asse II was never intended to contain such materials. And when the dangers became known, the German government was forced to build not just a barrier, but an emergency containment wall in a desperate effort to keep its contents locked in. Between 1967 and 78, more than 125,000 barrels of low and intermediate level radioactive waste were deposited here. These barrels contained materials contaminated with plutonium, strontium, cesium, and other long-lived isotopes from medical, industrial, and research sources. The idea at the time was that the salt mines offered a stable geological environment, ideal for permanent storage. What wasn't known, or perhaps was ignored, was the mine was unstable and prone to water ingress. By the early 1980s, brine began seeping into the mine chambers at a rate that raised alarms. Water and radioactive waste are a disastrous combination. If the brine reached the waste, it could leach radioactive material into groundwater and eventually into human water supplies. Germany was suddenly facing a potential radiological catastrophe right beneath its own feet. In 2009, the German Federal Office for Radiation Protection admitted what had long been suspected. The mine was not safe. The decision was made to retrieve the waste, a monumental task. But in the meantime, an emergency containment wall had to be constructed to stop the rising brine and potential outward migration of radioactivity. The wall they built wasn't permanent, it's a holding mechanism. The German government is still planning a full retrieval of the waste. That's a project expected to take decades and cost billions. Engineers must now reverse a process never designed to be undone, excavating sealed chambers and recovering corroded barrels that could rupture with the slightest mishandling. The residents of the surrounding towns live under an invisible threat. They can't see the wall, but they rely on it daily. Radiation doesn't care about policy or distance. It moves with water, dust, and with time. Number 5. The perimeter wall of Rikers Island. In the East River between Queens and the Bronx is one of the most infamous and heavily fortified islands in the United States, Rikers Island. While technically part of New York City, Rikers has long operated like a world unto itself, bound by a singular mission to contain. Not to protect, not defend, but confine, isolate, and control. The symbol of that mission isn't the buildings, the fences, or the runways nearby. It's the massive perimeter wall that encircles much of the core of the island. This was a wall built to keep people in, not metaphorically, literally. The wall is not one uniform structure, but a patchwork of high concrete barriers, reinforced steel fencing, surveillance towers, and razor wire-topped barricades. Here, tall concrete walls up to 20 feet high are buttressed by internal anti-vehicle trenches, floodlights, guard patrols, and cameras spaced every few meters. But it's the outer wall, the one that faces the shoreline, that stands as the ultimate physical barrier. It's been reinforced over the decades not to just keep the people in, but to resist the slow erosion of the island itself. Rikers Island was artificially expanded using landfill in the early 20th century, and erosion control now forms part of the containment strategy. Escape from Rikers is pretty rare, but not unheard of. The wall's been tested. In 1981, 2 inmates escaped by creating life vests out of garbage bags and scaling the southern wall before swimming to Queens. In the 1990s, a barge brought supplies close to the perimeter, and several inmates attempted to breach the wall using improvised grappling hooks. They failed, and every breach or attempt led to further reinforcements. There have been calls for reform. In 2017, New York City announced plans to close Rikers Island and replace it with a smaller borough-based jail, but the project has been delayed repeatedly and the wall remains. Every time the debate flares up, whether about bail reform, prison conditions, or the ethics of pre-trial detention, what gets forgotten is that the wall is still standing. It still holds. This isn't a wall built to protect society from invasion. It's a wall society built to store its failures, quietly out of view. Number 4. The polder walls of the Netherlands. The Netherlands. It's a country famous for its tulips, its windmills, and canals. But above all, it's known for one truth. Nearly 1/3 of its land lies below sea level. And yet millions of people live, farm, build cities, and thrive in areas that, by all natural logic, should be underwater. This is not the work of chance or divine luck. It is the product of walls. Walls not built to keep people out or to imprison anyone, but to contain something far more powerful, the sea itself. Their greatest weapon of this existential struggle has not been the military nor the state, but the polder wall, a system of dikes, levees, embankments, and engineered barriers designed to hold back water from the land that was never meant to be dry. These are not metaphorical defenses. They are real, massive, carefully engineered walls of earth and stone. And what they hold in, not out, is the Dutch people's most improbable achievement: vast areas of reclaimed land, the polders. Now, the term polder refers to land that's been reclaimed from a body of water, typically a sea or lake. Once the dikes are sealed and the water is removed, the land inside becomes usable, but only so long as the dike holds. It is essentially like a bowl, and every bowl needs walls. Take, for instance, the Beemster polder, one of the oldest and most iconic in the country. Created in the early 17th century by draining a lake using a system of windmills, the Beemster is surrounded by a 40-kilometer-long dike system, forming a perfectly rectangular patchwork of farmland and settlements that lies about 3.5 meters below sea level. That dike, continuously maintained and reinforced, holds back groundwater and protects against rising threat of storm surges. Without it, Beemster would vanish in a matter of days. And now multiply that by hundreds. There are over 3,500 polders in the Netherlands, protected by more than 22,000 kilometers of dikes and containment barriers. If you visit the Netherlands today, you may not notice these walls. In cities like Amsterdam, they've been camouflaged into parkways, residential neighborhoods, or even roadways. But they're there, quietly standing guard. In rural polder regions, the walls are even more critical, only a meter or two above the fields they encircle. But they're holding back tens of millions of liters of water every day, and in some areas, pumps run constantly to push the water back over the dikes and into canals. The walls the Dutch built are now being studied and replicated around the world. In Bangladesh, Jakarta, New Orleans, and even parts of London and New York, Dutch engineers are being consulted to design systems of levees and flood barriers that do what theirs have done for generations: keep the land dry. That's what makes the Dutch polder wall perhaps the most haunting containment wall on Earth. It doesn't just keep something in, it holds reality in place. History, nature, and the inevitable truth that someday, if the wall fails, all that's been stolen from the ocean will return to it. Number 3. The dike walls of the Salton Sea. In the desert of southeastern California lies a body of water that appears, at first glance, like a paradise in the wrong place. Vast, shimmering, and still, the Salton Sea stretches more than 30 miles from north to south. Now, this sea exists only because of a mistake. In 1905, engineers attempting to divert the Colorado River for irrigation accidentally caused it to rupture its banks. The floodwaters poured unchecked into the Salton Basin for nearly 2 years, creating a massive inland sea in a place that hadn't held water for thousands of years. And when the flood eventually stopped, the lake remained, fed for decades by agricultural runoff, evaporation, and sheer inertia. The dikes of the Salton Sea are massive, and in many places they're the only thing holding the lake in place. Built from compacted earth reinforced with riprap, which is chunks of broken rock, concrete, and in some cases steel retaining plates. They wrap the edge of the lake like a brittle collar. They're sun-cracked, exposed, and slowly eroding, but they're all that stand between the lake and the surrounding farms, towns, and natural preserves. Now, the reason these walls exist is pretty simple. The water is poisonous. For decades, the Salton Sea was sustained almost entirely by agricultural runoff, water tainted with pesticides, nitrates, animal waste, and chemical fertilizers. By the 1990s, the sea was saltier than the Pacific Ocean, and by the 2020s, it was nearly twice as saline. Fish die-offs became routine, birds feeding on them began to fall ill, and then the dust storms began. Some of the most vulnerable dikes are near population centers. The Sonny Bono Wildlife Refuge and the walls there separate thousands of acres of productive farmland from a creeping, chemical-laced shoreline. In these areas, the wall is doubled, an inner dike for the sea and an outer embankment for the dust control zone. So why not just drain the lake? Well, what lies inside is worse than the water itself. Draining the Salton Sea would unleash more than 50 square miles of exposed lake bed, and the dust load would become unmanageable. No amount of water trucks or soil-stabilizing chemicals could stop a toxic plume. That's why proposals have shifted towards containment by segmentation, building even more internal dikes to divide the lake into zones, one to stabilize dust and another to support limited bird habitat. You can drive along parts of the southern berms. They're hot, dry, and quiet, and the sun reflects off the lake that looks calm, but in reality, a pressurized system of chemical decay hemmed in by a wall that grows weaker every season. The wall does not inspire confidence, it inspires dread, and yet it has to hold. Number 2. The Slag Heap Containment Walls of Iron Mountain, holding in the wounds of a century of mining. Rising above the scrub-covered hills of Northern California, the slopes of Iron Mountain near Redding appear, at first glance, to be another worn-out industrial site. But what lies hidden within that rust-colored soil is something far more dangerous than abandoned equipment or forgotten tunnels. Beneath Iron Mountain is one of the most toxic environments ever created, and the only thing standing between it and ecological disaster is an engineered system of containment walls. Barriers built not to protect the mountain from people, but to trap what it continues to leak: sulfuric acid, heavy metals, and chemical death. This is a story of a wall not around a city, a prison, or a fortress, but around a legacy of chemical ruin, and one that still requires daily vigilance. Iron Mountain was once one of the richest sources of iron, silver, copper, zinc, and gold in California, and mining began in the late 19th century, and it expanded dramatically throughout the 20th. Vast networks of underground tunnels were blasted and dug, and the ore extracted was processed on site. But this activity, especially the exposure of pyrite or iron sulfide to air and water, triggered a catastrophic environmental phenomenon, acid mine drainage or AMD. When pyrite is exposed to oxygen and water, it produces sulfuric acid, and that acid leached into the soil and water, dissolving heavy metals like lead, arsenic, cadmium, and zinc. The mountain became a factory of poison. Even after the mines were closed in 1963, the chemical reactions continued and intensified. The mine began producing acid of such concentration that it set a world record, a pH of -3.6, a level more acidic than battery acid. The primary wall to contain it, a slag heap containment embankment, was designed to trap and isolate the most active AMD zones. It was constructed from compacted earth, synthetic liners, and gravel filtering beds, and it's more than 70 feet tall. Reinforced concrete spillways and chemical retention ponds were also constructed, each one designed to resist erosion, neutralize acids, and hold the mountain's ongoing chemical assault. But perhaps the most fascinating and terrifying aspect of Iron Mountain's containment system was that it was not designed to stop the reaction, only to just wall it in. The chemical processes inside the mine are still happening, and this continues to bleed acid. But thanks to this network of retaining walls, collection chambers, and treatment plants, this site can be managed for now. Iron Mountain's barriers are not meant to last forever. Engineers estimate that maintenance will be required for 3,000 years. In effect, the walls must become generational infrastructure, passed down from agency to agency like a dark heirloom. But they're not monuments, they're scars. They say, something happened here, something we can't undo, but we can keep it in, at least for now. Number 1. The Binhai New Area Landfill Wall, China's 60-foot barrier to contain a rising sea of waste. On the coastline of Tianjin, a megacity with over 13 million people and one of China's busiest ports, there's a wall that dwarfs the average person in height, length, and silent consequence. It doesn't guard an army or shelter civilians from invasion. It wraps around something far more persistent, far more volatile, one of the world's largest engineered landfills. The Binhai New Area Landfill in Tianjin is a massive repository of urban and industrial waste. More than 10,000 tons of garbage enter the site every day, brought in by convoys of garbage trucks from residential neighborhoods, office parks, facilities, and chemical plants. In some places, the trash is more than 70 feet deep, but it's not the mountain of waste that makes the site terrifying. It's what's trying to escape from inside it. This is why the site encased a giant retaining wall built to industrial specifications. It rises more than 60 feet in places, made of heavily reinforced concrete, impermeable clay layers, and geomembranes, with multi-layered leachate control systems. Now, this wall was not part of the landfill's original construction. Like many of Chinese megastructures, the landfill outgrew its design quickly. As Tianjin's economy surged in the early 2000s and China's urbanization exploded, so did the waste. Municipal solid waste, industrial solvents, heavy metal sludge, and underneath it all, gravity and time did their quiet work, compressing layers and releasing rivers of leach into a thick brown-black fluid composed of decaying organic matter and whatever chemicals it picks up along the way. At its base, the wall sits on a deep foundation platform made of compacted stone columns and sand-filled trenches designed to distribute load. The middle of the walls contain a reinforced concrete core, especially important in the event of an earthquake, which could turn the landfill into a seething slurry of unstable waste. Lining the inside face of the wall in direct contact with the waste mass is a mat, a self-contained clay layer that swells when exposed to liquid. Above that is a geosynthetic liner, essentially a heavy-duty plastic membrane that acts as a second impermeable shield. But what really defines this wall is the burden. It doesn't just contain static material, it contains decay in motion. Inside the wall is a biologically active mountain of garbage that constantly generates heat, pressure, gas, and liquid. Temperatures in the core of the landfill routinely exceed 70 degrees Celsius or 158 degrees Fahrenheit. Gas wells snake down into the core and release pressure through flaring towers. Yet if a gas pocket forms too close to the wall and isn't vented in time, it can cause heaving and fracturing in the interior clay seals. Well, a wall breach here wouldn't look like a dam bursting. It would begin with an invisible seep, brown sludge leaking into nearby storm channels, then a smell, hydrogen sulfide. Then animals would begin to die, first fish, then birds. And if the break was large enough, it could trigger a liquefaction slide, in which the weight of the waste causes the entire structure to collapse outward. This isn't speculation either. China has already experienced that. In 2015, a landfill retaining wall in Shenzhen failed catastrophically after a week of heavy rain, burying the nearby industrial park in a massive wave of construction debris. The incident killed 73 people and was declared a man-made disaster. It was never meant to be temporary. It is a wall with no end, built not for conflict or ideology, but to trap a mistake that cannot be undone. Unlike historic fortresses that fall into ruin or prison walls that one day crumble with progress, the Binhai Wall must remain, not just for decades, but perhaps generations. And unlike symbolic borders, it will never define a nation's character. It defines its burden. Thanks for watching, everybody.